Almost all of the soldiers fighting here are volunteers who signed contracts for the duration of the so-called special military operation. In other words, when the war ends, their contracts say they go back to Civvy Street. They're going to go back, a lot of them with physical and mental injuries that the system is just not geared to deal with. Again, it's one of these issues. Everyone talks about the importance of the need to be prepared for the veterans. No one is doing anything on the right scale. A lot of them are brutalized and criminalized. Indeed, many of them actually were recruited out of the prison camp system. We've already got hundreds of murders, for example, that's carried out by soldiers who've returned home. Well, that says nothing to what's going to hit when these numbers come back. You're going to have a huge influx of guns because a lot of people have picked up sort of what we could think of as trophy guns off the battlefield, whether for use or whether just to sell. So you're going to have an even larger black market of guns within Russia and outside. And what I'm seeing at the moment is, as I say, that there's no preparation. Putin doesn't like handling tough issues. In many ways, the real goal was to avoid a Trump-related disaster. And in that, I can say it was a glorious success. However, the price of that glorious success is committing NATO to a very wobbly, people say 5% of GDP spent on defense. Well, it's not really. It's 3.5% spent on defense, 1.5% spent on defense-related expenditure, which, as we've seen, can mean everything. It can mean everything from aid to Ukraine to rural broadband in the name of resilience. So basically, no government's going to have any trouble filling the 1.5%. So anyway, it's really a 3.5% sort of figure. Even so, I mean, given that 9 NATO members don't currently hit the 2% figure, that's fairly sort of nonsensical in some ways. Ukraine was very much relegated to the margins, despite the rhetoric from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, trying to more or less say that we need to be spending vastly more on defense or Putin will come and invade us next Wednesday. In the final communique, an unusually short one, presumably because it had to be written in crayon, but in the final communique, NATO has just simply describing Russia as a long-term threat, not an immediate or an existential one. And the price of all of this was an extraordinary self-abasement by so many figures, including Mark Rutte, writing almost kind of pastiche Trumpian messages to him that Trump then gleefully recirculated, saying how, basically he'd won a great victory and Europe's going to pay big now and such like. So although in the margins of the event, there was all sorts of talk about European strategic autonomy, how Europe can basically try and secure itself without needing to depend on a potentially volatile America. In practice, it's hard to see how anyone really came out of this with anything meaningful that they were hoping for.
And Mark, significantly no condemnation of Russia's aggression in that joint declaration at the end. But while you were there, you were discussing exactly that in a panel discussion, Taming the Bear, it was called, countering Russia's enduring threat. What did you want to get across?
Well, I mean, I think from my point of view, it was to try and get this idea that, look, deterrence, and let's be honest, the goal is deterrent. It's not about winning wars. It's about trying to prevent wars. And the goal of deterrence, yes, it may well involve buying more tanks and more missiles and more planes and perhaps even recruiting more soldiers. But there's 2 other key points. One of them is, look, the real threat we face from Russia for them, at least for the moment, and in my opinion, for quite some time to come, is not from any kind of direct invasion. Russia's forces are mired in Ukraine. It's going to take them 8 years at least to fully reconstitute. It's all this range of sub-threshold activities, the so-called hybrid war, political war, grey zone warfare, the sabotage, assassinations, disinformation and the like. And we also have to think about much more sharply about how we deter that, because we're not very good at that at all, and we need to be more imaginative and more asymmetrical. But the final point is to realize that really in this case, the battle for deterrence is going to be won purely in Putin's head. It's about shaping his perceptions about how tough, how capable of defending itself Europe really is, how willing to defend itself Europe really is. And in that respect, we tend to focus on the easily countable things like budgets and tanks. rather than the political and perceptional things. So yes, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be spending on the tanks. That's the kind of the necessary precondition. But we also have to think about the political way we frame all this. And unfortunately, sorry, I'm just on my soapbox. I'm going to give one last point, and then I will shut up. It is quite simply that at the moment, in the name of getting more money for defence-related spending, are we actually increasing the scope for disagreement between allies? We've already had Spain saying it's not going to hit that 5%, and there are other countries that are essentially close to that. And also divisions within our countries, because to spend more, that money has to come from somewhere. Increased borrowing, increased taxes, less money on other public spending or whatever. Are we actually going to undermine, in many ways, our appearance of being resolute in the name of getting the tools of resolution?
And when you talk about shaping the deterrence inside Putin's head, how should we be doing that?
Well, I think one of the key things is clearly about projecting this sense of true unity. There's not much we can do about what happens in the White House. We have to recognize that the limitations thereof. So we have to be thinking much more about making it clear that even a small scale intervention, which is, at present, the only thing that we need to worry about. Putin does not have sort of a spare army he can throw at Europe at the moment, and he certainly won't, as I said, for some time to come after the war in Ukraine ends. But there is talk about some kind of lower level incursion, the so-called little green men turning up in the Estonian border city of Narva, perhaps, or filtering into some sort of island in the Baltic or similar. We need to demonstrate that we do have not only the forces capable of actually dealing with that, but also absolutely the will to do so. And I think this is the issue. Will is not expressed through statements. I think Putin already has internalized this idea that Europe talks big, but very rarely delivers. So in some ways, I think we should perhaps dial down the rhetoric, but actually at the same time demonstrate through war games, through all sorts of forward positioning and such like, that we are ready and capable of dealing with the kind of small scale testing incursion that Putin could conceivably launch.
So how has the Kremlin and how has Putin adapted and adjusted since the events 2 years ago when Yevgeny Prigozhin launched that mutinous march?
In several ways. First of all, they've realized the danger of allowing people to have private armies. And therefore, although there are still mercenaries, particularly there's the so-called Africa Corps, a rather unfortunate name, which has essentially incorporated now pretty much all of Wagner's assets in Africa. Although they are technically a commercial organization, in practice it's run by Russian military intelligence. And so likewise, even where you've got still sort of surviving mercenary groups and elements that have been funded by corporations and regional governments in Russia fighting in Ukraine, they're all very tightly controlled. So first of all, no more private armies. Secondly, though, there has been as an attempt to try and tighten up the internal security. The Federal Security Service, the main internal political police force, its department, which is called the Department for Military Counterintelligence, but is actually the Department for Spying on the Soldiers to make sure they don't launch a coup. Well, it has now extended dramatically its elements, which are actually looking at these kind of mercenary and sort of militia forces. So they're trying to make sure that they catch it in the bud next time. But the final point is what they haven't been able to do, and that's the obvious thing, is essentially carry out a purge or a reshuffle of the elements of the security apparatus that clearly did not do well. They didn't really predict this. And even when it happened, they didn't mobilize as they were ordered to try and stop this force getting anywhere near Moscow, because there is that sense of they can't afford to do so at the moment. Any kind of purge disrupts as you're trying to work out, who's in, who's out. And I think at the moment, the thought of disrupting the internal security agencies at a time when there is considerable quiet disquiet, but nonetheless there, about the war, about what Putin has got. In a way, Putin is now, to a degree, hostage of his own security apparatus.
That's an interesting concept. And in your latest podcast, you do actually consider the long-term impact of the war in Ukraine on Russian society and the consequences that the society will have to face up to when it does end. Can you just explain what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've got over a million, probably closer to 1.5 million Russian soldiers and others who are sort of basically in the war or have gone through the war. And that's a huge proportion. If one compares it with the sort of the last similar type conflict, which would be the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, less than 1% of Soviet citizens experienced this in Afghanistan during a 10-year span. This war, 3.5 years in, it's already a much greater proportion of Russian citizens. And of that million to 1.5 million, again, if we take pulse wars as any judge, about a third are going to be suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, and 10% it's going to be full blown. There's going to be a huge need when the war ends. And remember, almost all of the soldiers fighting here are volunteers who signed contracts for the duration of the so-called special military operation. In other words, when the war ends, their contracts say they go back to Civic Street. They're going to go back, a lot of them with physical and mental injuries that the system is just not geared to deal with. Again, it's one of these issues. Everyone talks about the importance of the need to be prepared for the veterans. No one is doing anything on the right scale. A lot of them are brutalized and criminalized. Indeed, many of them actually were recruited out of the prison camp system. We've already got hundreds of murders, for example, that's carried out by soldiers who've returned home. Well, that says nothing to what's going to hit when these numbers come back. You're going to have a huge influx of guns because a lot of people have picked up sort of what we could think of as trophy guns off the battlefield, whether for use or whether just to sell. So you're going to have an even larger black market of guns within Russia and outside. And what I'm seeing at the moment is, as I say, that there's no preparation. Putin doesn't like handling tough issues. In some ways, he's treating this a bit like how he treated COVID, to say this is really important, and then actually dump the responsibility on regional governors, on his government, and so forth. And they haven't got the funds to do this. So my big concern is, this will be inevitably a shock to Russian society. What happens if Putin thinks it's too big a shock? Again, Putin is risk averse. If he thinks that the danger is you're going to get a lot of people coming back feeling angry, forming their own political movements, maybe blaming the Kremlin for not treating them rightly, as they should, well, maybe it's safer to keep the war going rather than to let his soldiers come home.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.